Hi, this is Amanda.
And this is Jen.
And you're listening to Just This, a podcast that explores everything around being and becoming a mother or parent.
We're excited to have you join us as we dive into the practical details as well as the unseen energetics on topics that span from preconception to years after birth.
Okay, so today we're going to dive into, this is a little bit of an expansion on our Midwives and Doulas episode. So if you haven't listened to that one, highly recommend checking out that episode. I'll link it in the show notes, where we talk a little bit about the difference between midwives and doulas. We do expand in that one a little bit on some of the different doulas, but what we didn't expand on too much was the different kinds of midwives and how midwives differ from OBGYNs. And we have our resident expert, Jen, here to really dive into that.
I use that.
Yes.
Awesome.
Because she's a home birth midwife, basically.
Yes. Technically in Nevada, I can just call myself that.
Yes.
California, not yet. But yes, almost there. Almost there.
That's a whole part that we can wrap into this, is each state has different rules and regulations, something we don't think about, but
yeah, let's start with the home birth midwives. What do you think about that?
Yeah, let's start with the home birth midwives. And then we can roll into how a home birth midwife differs from a midwife in the hospital, and how a midwife in the hospital differs from having just your OBGYN deliver.
Perfect. And I think we'll also kind of briefly talk about in there too, like birth centers, because that's kind of included with home birth midwives as well. So yeah, let's start with home birth midwives. We were talking a little bit about licensing. And so each state, as we kind of suggested here earlier, is going to have different regulations for midwives. So for instance, in Nevada, where I'm currently residing, there is no regulation at all for home birth midwives. So that means I could just say, hey, I'm a midwife, and start practicing, which I wouldn't do because I've had a ton of schooling and experience. And yeah, you want to be ready. But there's also people that don't believe in there's midwives, I should say, not people, having to have licensures and regulations. And this is why Nevada is not currently licensed, because there's a lot of debate around that. Maybe for another topic, but home birth midwives are trained to deal with normal births at home. And by normal, we mean like no high risk. And if you listen to our podcast, you know, Amanda's pregnancy, she kind of went from a low risk pregnancy to a high risk one because of your baby's restricted growth. So we only deal with normal, and that's what keeps home birth safe. And the regulations are different from every state. So some of them require that you become a licensed midwife. Other ones you don't. So just look up what is in your state. And the difference between a home birth midwife and a hospital birth midwife is called a certified nurse midwife. And those are the ones that you will see in hospitals generally. Home birth midwives are called certified professional midwives. Some of them have training, and some of them are like lay midwives. So there's kind of three. Lay midwives are generally ones that are not licensed. Certified professional midwives generally have some training, and then you have your nurse ones that go into the hospitals. We have the same as like a certified professional midwife and a certified nurse midwife. We have the same abilities that a nurse midwife has. We just do it at home, and that's where our training is at. And I was listening to a podcast once, and I thought this was like really stated well. They're like, if you want to have a home birth, you should hire a midwife that is trained in home birth settings, right? And if you want to have a hospital birth with a midwife, then you want to have a certified nurse midwife because they're trained in the hospital setting. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think my understanding is a home birth midwife just never works in a hospital, and a hospital midwife usually is employed by the hospital. So they generally don't work at home in homes for in-home births.
Correct.
Birthing doulas do a little bit more crossover. Like I know birthing doulas that would do home births and hospitals, and usually they have a preference. However, my understanding is midwives they don't do crossover. They're either home birth or they are either hospital, right?
Correct. Yeah. And part of that, like a lot of regulation around that is that the nurse midwives are not regulated or allowed to actually do home births because they have to be under the umbrella of a doctor, an MD. And so there's not a lot of doctors that are willing to put their malpractice on the line to cover someone in case something happens.
Were you saying though that basically a hospital midwife, which would be the nurse midwife, they have more training than a home birth midwife technically? No, less.
Potentially, but it's like if you have a licensed midwife, like the curriculum I'm going through, we have the same amount of training. So, and we have the same privileges. Like we can do IVs, we can draw blood, we can suture, all those things. And so the schooling is very extensive, especially for licensed home birth professional midwives, as well as nurse midwives. The difference too is like when you're in a hospital, you have a ton of staff with you, right? So you're trained in a setting that looks very different compared to a home birth midwife. When we go into a home, there's only usually 1 or 2 certified or licensed midwives. So the setup is completely different. We're self-reliant and we bring everything with us. So we come with oxygen, we come with IVs, we come with medications, things to help hemorrhaging. And anything that lies outside of normal, we are going to transfer to the hospital so that we make sure that mom and baby are safe. Nurses, they're already in the hospital, so they already have all that as backup. They have the extra staff, the support, and all that stuff. But even then, if something's happening during the labor that falls outside of normal within the hospital, they too will have an OB come in to take over and manage the birth because it falls outside of low risk.
Okay, so first comment on that, and then I have something else maybe we can expand on later. But I do know, and I guess maybe these go hand in hand. So I did want to talk about the difference of the states that don't have any regulations, and maybe how do you know like what's a good midwife or making sure that your midwife is qualified if there's no regulations. But also on that note, I do know even in the states where there are regulations, and just like you're saying, if it becomes a high risk situation, there's wishy-washy lines with that. There's certain midwives that are more willing, and maybe they won't, if they are in a more regulated state, state that, but they are more willing to work with parents, say if it's a breech birth or if some other situations come up, there are different midwives that are more flexible, even if it's not within the regulations. And I know that's just a very murky water and case by case situation because, like you said, there's still malpractice and you have to really trust the person, the mother that you're working with. And you can go back to our episode of birth is not like ordering cabinets because it's very easy for the birthing parents to put the blame on the person delivering. And should something go wrong, and I think that's why there are all these things in place that if it is high risk, it gets taken into a setting where it's less and less likely that the blame will be put on outside of by chances of things happening.
And it's also not necessarily like less blame on somebody, but it's providing care that we just don't necessarily have at home. If a baby is not doing well during labor and we think that when they come out, they're going to need support, we only have so much support. But at a hospital, they have a literal team of like 4 or 5 respiration specialists for that neonate that we don't have that. They have, lines pumped from the wall to help put in oxygen and like suction out mucus and all kinds of different things that as a midwife we have access to some extent, but we don't have a team of resuscitation specialists in that way.
I get that aspect, but then there's a lot of things that are defined as high risk births that maybe that you just don't know. Like for example, going over 42 weeks. Is that really high risk? Sometimes it's not high risk. It's just we state that, it is high risk. Or a breech baby, is that high risk? Yes, there's a little bit more of a risk. Is it high enough though to say, no, we're not doing this birth at home. We're not even going to try it. We're going to just do it straight in the hospital. So I think those are the situations I'm talking about.
You're talking more about regulations as opposed to like a safety. So in states that are licensed, there is regulations about what you can't do. For instance, in California, you can't have a breech home birth. You can't have twins. You can't go over 42 weeks. In Nevada here, we can go 44 weeks. You know what I mean? Because there is no regulations. That is different. And I think the reason I really want to like kind of separate that out a little bit is because sometimes as midwives, when we arrive to hospitals, we get a lot of pushback from medical providers. Like, you're bringing in the kind of emergent situation. A lot of times when we bring stuff in, it is not necessarily emergent, but we are bringing in something that needs assistance. You only see the bad that we bring in. You only see the things that need assistance, and we're bringing it in because we know this is outside of our skill level, and we want the support, and we want to make sure mom and baby are safe. But as far as like going over 42 weeks, the research definitely needs to be redone on that whole thing for sure. I have my own opinions, but I'll keep them quiet for now. Yeah, midwives kind of can have that choice and kind of soften what they choose to do based on what they want. And there's also midwives that do not want to get licensed because traditionally, and even OBs, they actually all really learned from home birth midwives, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you think about it, a lot of the stuff that we've learned, that's how we were brought into the world, is through births and technically home birth midwives. Yeah. So regulation, I think, is more what you're talking about as opposed to like bringing in like.
Well, you just mentioned the high risk pregnancy. And I think I just wanted to, differentiate that there's a difference between high risk as defined by whatever state you are in versus being in labor and realizing we're in a situation where the safest thing would be to go to the hospital at this point. And that happens.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a difference there. And then piggybacking on that, every state has their different regulations, which is interesting in itself. That could raise the question, well, how do I find somebody if you're in a state where there isn't regulations? Like, how do you know that the midwife is going to be qualified? And oftentimes, from my understanding, I think this is what you were just saying, is it's not like somebody's going to be like, I'm a midwife, I can do this. They're most of the time, no, they have worked under, they've been in a mentorship and basically worked under and trained under somebody who's been doing this for decades. And that is where the experience and the teaching comes from. There isn't just that they don't pass whatever tests that some states might have. Like you said, I've heard very differing opinions about that on whether those are really actually good or not. I don't know. There is a great group called Indie Birth, which I can link to, and they are very much on the side of the non-regulated midwifery and bringing midwifery back to what it originally was, which is not becoming a doctor or a nurse per se. Well, there are beneficial things, and maybe there's some crossover. It isn't really training to be a doctor or nurse. It's training to keep mamas safe and deliver babies and be there as an usher of that. And really to honor, their big thing is to really honor the sovereignty of the mother as they're going through that experience and be that support for them there. So I just wanted to touch on the fact that even if it's not regulated, it's very easy to know, and you will know just from word of mouth, oh, this person has delivered X amount of babies, or they've attended or trained under this person. And it's usually a very good indicator of how experienced they are. And also you can feel it to your own comfort level.
I think that's the most important thing, is really trusting someone and like intuitively feeling safe with them. I think that there's going to be the best midwife in the world, and you might just not jive with them. And that's not the best midwife for you. So I think really like leaning into your intuition is really important. And to kind of go back to the whole like the indie birth that you mentioned, I really love them. I love listening to them because midwifery, the whole point of midwifery model of care is really about choice and as much unbiased medical choice as possible. And when you're under state regulations, for instance, a breech birth in California, you either go against your license and potentially put that up to not have be able to work again, or you tell them you can't do it. And so that then does not allow that person to choose what they feel is best for them in that case. But yeah, I think trust is the biggest thing in midwifery. You want to be able to trust your providers, because if something comes up, you want to be able to trust them that they will tell you and give you their best piece of advice, because you're in a situation and a state of mind, especially if it's in labor, you're like in a different state of mind that you want to be able to fully be like, I don't know right now. What would you do? Or, what is your recommendation at this point?
Yeah. But is there anything else you want to put in there between the difference of a home birth and a hospital birth midwife?
Yeah. I think the main thing, like if we could sum it up, is hospital birth midwives, CNMs, certified nurse midwives, are trained in the hospital, and certified professional midwives or midwives are trained for the home. So I've never been trained in a hospital. I don't know what to do in a hospital. I don't know where their equipment's at, nothing like that, but I've been trained at home. And I think that sums it up the best.
Yeah. And so when you do transfer to a hospital, if you are doing a home birth, then at that point, you cannot practice as a midwife. Technically, you kind of turn into more of a doula role, right? The hands-on part is not going to happen. Yeah. I'd like to also dive into the difference between a hospital midwife and an OBGYN and how those differ.
Okay, I love it. So hospital midwives, we kind of already talked about that a little bit. OBs, so hospital midwives are trained similarly in the sense that they have they deal with normal, low risk births. Anything that goes into high risk is an OB. I think I heard it said best, OBs are surgeons. And sometimes we need surgeons, right? Like sometimes things happen and we unfortunately need to do cesarean despite our beautiful idea of what our birth should look like, ordering those cabinets for birth, right? Sometimes we do need it. And so I think that really defines what the difference is between hospital-based midwife and an OB. OBs are surgeons. Nurse midwives are midwives trained in a hospital setting.
And isn't it true that an OB isn't in there until pretty much the baby's like almost out?
Correct.
Nurses
they'll come in, do some checks, but yeah, usually it's not until the baby's out. Hospital birth midwives will be a little bit more in the room with you during labor, definitely more than an OB usually, for sure.
If you don't have a hospital birth midwife and you have an OB delivering, though, it's usually the nurses that are there with you, correct? Until it's
most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think too, when our brains, like you mentioned, an OB is a surgeon. I don't know as much how the whole hospital system works. It's very interesting because my experience was with working with a birthing center. I also did have to, when it became quote unquote higher risk for me, I was going in and getting monitored. And I do remember, I think, meeting with an OB a couple of times, but they were very kind. And I don't even think they were there for my birth, that person I was meeting with.
That's pretty common. Hospital births, you're not going to usually see the same person. It's whoever's there on the shift. You might, but it's who's ever on the shift. That will be your care provider.
So I think that's like a good thing to point out too, is when you're working with a midwife, correct me if I'm wrong, because I have no idea about this either. If you're working with a hospital midwife, are you working with the same person throughout? Is it a continuum of care?
Not necessarily. A lot of hospitals are shift-based. I don't know maybe in different states, there's hospitals that are not shift-based. You might see your same midwife for, your prenatal visits, but if you go into labor, they may or may not be there depending on if it's their shift or not.
Yeah. So really quickly, let's talk about birth centers, because these are the in-betweens. And
yes, people call them the in-betweens.
Yeah. It's interesting because birth centers, there is no gray room, wiggle room, where I was mentioning if you're working with a home birth midwife, should a regulation come up, a high risk situation, a birthing center is going to follow all the regulations as a hospital would, because they are technically under more watch, I think, like a statewide, because it's an actual center and it's a place you go to. And the birthing center is great because as a birthing parent, if you're not quite comfortable doing it at home, it gives you an opportunity to have more of the homey feel. Usually it's a space with maybe a few rooms at most. The one that I was going to in San Francisco, I think is still around. It just has 2 rooms, maybe 3. And you're working with a smaller team. So it's similar to what you're saying. There might be shifts, but there's only 4 or 5 midwives. So you get to know those midwives over the course of your pregnancy. You're meeting usually with each of them at least once, and they're getting to know you. So you feel a more intimate connection with the team.
Mm-hmm.
And then you are experiencing birth in a place where they also potentially have some of the stuff that a home birth midwife not have on hand, because you're going to a space where they have that stuff. It's a very nice room. They have the baths. They'll allow the water births, at least in California, things like that, where they won't usually allow that stuff in a hospital. It's a nice, I don't want to be in a hospital setting, but this gives me a little bit more of that home birth energy and feel. And I felt like they honored a lot more of the labor at home for as long as you can, this and that. They do honor a little bit more of what I felt was the natural birthing spectrum of things. So yeah. And you do get the aftercare too and postpartum, which is something you do not get from the hospital at all.
No.
Which is crazy.
And also it is so crazy. Actually, I think that's so crazy. And also too, one of the big differences with a hospital birth compared to a birth center is that in a birth center, you will have that same midwife throughout your whole labor, right? Like that midwife is probably not, like, when she's on shift with you, she's probably not going to go in 12 hours because she's off shift. She'll probably stay with you until baby's born. Where in a hospital, when their shift's over, they're going to probably head home or whatever. One big misconception about birth centers is that it's safer than a home birth. But the fact is that actually it's all the same. So it's just at a location, typically near a hospital. So it's closer to hospitals generally. So that gives a sense of safety for people. But they have all the same equipment that we bring into the home. It's not really any difference. A lot of birth centers are regulated by certified nurse midwives, which are then under the umbrella of a MD. And so that's how that whole regulation works, and maybe why they're a little bit more stricter and follow more of the hospital protocols for that reason. But as far as like licensing goes, they're basically a home birth in like a certain location. Exactly. But I think, like you said, it's all really, I think when we choose like what direction do we want to choose, the most important thing is remembering what makes you feel the most safe. You want to feel safe in your pregnancy. It doesn't matter where it happens. Doesn't matter if it happens at home, in a birth center, on a plane, in a hospital, like where's the Dr. Seuss book, right? Just feel safe. That's ultimately what matters. And however that looks for you, then do that. That's what you want. You want to feel safe. You're going to be totally opened and vulnerable, and you want that safety. And I think that's the most important thing. And a good midwife is going to want that too. We want a safe mom and baby. Ultimately, that's our goal. We don't really care where it takes place at. Ideally, we'd love for it to take place at home for people because that's what we're trained in and that's why we're following our career paths. But if it can't take place there, then let's go have a safe, healthy outcome. That's the ultimate.
Can we just tap into insurance things really quick? Because you probably know this again more than I would. I do know the birthing center, there are insurances that do cover that sometimes going into, I think it just depends on your insurance. I don't know if that's the case with home birth. Is it similar that some insurances do cover it and some don't, just depends on your plan?
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Yep. I know even Medicare, and Medicaid, before I left California, they were trying to get home birth midwifery covered through Medi-Cal, which is Medicaid too in other states. So they're trying. They're really trying. But you just check with your insurance, call them, ask.
Want to encourage people also that if it's not covered by your insurance, but it's something you really want, to not just rule it out. I feel that can be a thing that people face where they're just state, oh, my insurance doesn't cover this. This is going to cost too much. There's no way. I strongly encourage you to at least talk with the midwives or talk with the birthing center or whatever it is. Oftentimes there are other funding programs out there that help support people who are in financial need. And if it's something you really want, there's usually a way to make it happen, even if you're in a financial pinch. So you're dealing with people who really care about you as a person. If you're talking about birthing centers and home birth midwives, unlike the hospital. So you're of actually, and on that note, potentially it could even be potentially cheaper out of pocket, because there are so many expenses that occur in a hospital sometimes that aren't even covered by your insurance, which always blows my mind.
It's so true. Yeah, home birth is actually cheaper than a vaginal, normal, like no complication hospital birth. And on that note, yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of midwives are completely open to like doing payments, partial trades. I've even had midwives do. You're right. They're not in it. Midwifery, you're not in it for the money. Like it just doesn't equate to that, especially a home birth midwife. So they do really care. And the other thing I want to point out, which a lot of people don't know about, which is called matrice care, midwifery care. And so that's when you do a lot of your care in the hospital, but you can also see a midwife, kind of like co-care thing. And the benefit of that, I think, besides just having an hour visit with somebody that really cares with you, as opposed to a 15-minute, let's check your baby through ultrasound and then, okay, great, move on. You also get that postpartum care. So that's also another option. Like if your insurance does cover it, but you still want a little bit of that midwifery care too. Some midwives do that as well.
With that, would they still have the baby in the hospital? Because I actually know people who did something similar like that, but actually did the home birth, but then they were working, they would still go to appointments in the hospital. And I think that gave them some sense of security, maybe a little bit more, but they ultimately were having the baby at home. So you could do it either way. You could have a baby in the hospital and still work with a midwife, or have a home birth and then still attend your hospital visits potentially, and just to have those extra measurements and data that usually maybe a home birth midwife doesn't do because they don't feel it's as necessary.
Yeah. We do all the same testing that an OB or anyone else would offer. But yeah, we just don't necessarily do it at home. So maybe if you're at the clinic, like, hey, go downstairs and do, random XYZ test. Yeah. Again, like we'll do certain blood tests and things like that, but
awesome.
Cool. I guess we're going to have to save the other episode for doulas because that's like a whole nother topic, I think.
If you haven't checked out the Midwives and Doulas episode, again, like we'll link it in the show notes. That one, we definitely expand a little bit more on the different kinds of doulas. We could do a deeper dive with that, but we didn't touch on any of this. And I think it's valuable to know the difference of different midwives, because I think when someone does usually think midwife, they only think of home birth. That's traditionally, I feel like, what people are thinking. And it's good to know that there's midwives in the hospital. There's this middle ground of birthing centers. There's a lot of options out there. And I highly encourage people to explore working with a midwife on some level. Even if you are doing a full hospital birth, you can state, can I meet with a midwife every time you're going in for an appointment? Or can I have a midwife do my delivery, basically? And the earlier you can state that and the more often you can state that, I think the better chances you will have at getting it. Ultimately, what happened in my experience, because I was a high risk pregnancy in the end, couldn't give birth at the birthing center, I ended up at the hospital. However, they transferred the midwives from the birthing center were really great. They knew hospital midwives there. So they specifically were in touch with them when I was on my way in. So they set me up. They set me up with a good hospital midwife. And basically, that person was my midwife through the process and was really great. And the way they handled things, you can just tell the way they handle things, or they'll wait for the contraction to be over to talk to you, and they'll talk through the options with you and say what they feel is best. But again, talk through the option and give you the option. And all of it is just a totally different approach to care that an OB just isn't trained in, because that's not their training. And I think that's what I was going back to with the OB thing. And you were saying their surgeon. I mean, anyone who's going to go through medical school and be trained in that sense, that's medicine. Birthing doesn't need to be medical. I love that statement that the ND birth people say, whereas birth is a natural experience. It's not a medical incident. It really isn't
a medical event. Yeah.
A medical event, unless it becomes that. But it doesn't start as a medical event. It's It's something that your
No.
body's truly doing. I mean, do you consider having your period a medical event every time? Maybe. I don't know. So
Maybe.
yeah, I think it's like good to remember.
Maybe depends on who you're asking.
So
Totally
anyway,
joking.
but when your mind has been trained in medicine, it's easy for that perspective to come out versus when you're dealing with a midwife. It's a different perspective of background and training and experience and connection. And
Yeah.
I just wish our country would give midwives to everybody for their birth. And if you're inspired and like want to become a midwife, I don't know, and listening to this for some reason, reach out to Jen. We definitely need more midwives in our world, I think, as well.
We do.
So,
and just you brought up one thing that I think is really interesting that someone pointed out to me, and that's that OBs have actually really never seen a normal physiological birth. Like they really don't know what that looks like. And so that's like to kind of like back up their whole aspect of how they interact with you as an individual. It's just that they don't know what that looks like. And for us in my licensing, like we have to go part of like to get licensed, we have to go into a hospital and have a planned hospital birth and watch a couple of them process and go through. And OBs do not have to go to a home birth and be like, hey, this is what a normal physiological birth looks like. They've only been trained to know what hospitals have. And hospitals have a lot of interventions, a lot of times, a lot of epidurals, a lot of things like that, which when you need those, heck yeah, medicine is awesome in that way. But I just want to say that too, that a lot of OBs don't know what a normal birth looks like unless maybe they've had a home birth themselves. And that's even a different perspective. So yeah. I love OBs. I love nurse midwives. We all need our space. And again, there is no wrong place to birth. It's wherever you feel safest. I think that's my big takeaway here.
Yeah, I love that. I think we should end on that. It's coming back to our instincts and our inner wisdom and knowing what's going to be right for us. There is a little topic that popped up there that I'm like, oh, we can expand on this of just what we're exposed to. I'm like, oh, even beyond OBs, it's like how many people in our country have ever seen just regular physiological birth?
Yeah.
You know, expose yourself to it. Watch
Not a
it
lot.
before you give birth.
Well, and my big thing with that too is how many people have seen breastfeeding in our country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
like
many
legit,
things we
like,
could just spin off on here.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
okay,
we'll leave it at that. Strongly encourage you to explore the world of connecting with a midwife and choose the option that's going to be best for you and your baby.
Hey there, amazing listeners. We just want to say a huge thank you for tuning into our convo on the Just This podcast today. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners, and your continued support means the world to us.
If you enjoyed this episode and found value in it, we would be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform or share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it too. Your reviews and shares not only motivate us, but they also help others discover our show.
We're also all about keeping the conversation going and hanging out with our incredible community. Head over to justthis.site, that's justhis.site, where you'll find additional resources, ways to connect with us, and join the conversation, plus some more goodies.
Thank you again for being a part of the Just This community. We'll be back soon. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself and embrace the wonder as you navigate this extraordinary adventure.